Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Buffnagel the podcast, where we explore entertaining and enlightening discussions of the adventure of life and all things good. From science and technology to history and philosophy to leadership and success. We hope to give you a better understanding of the world and skills for everyone to pursue their own adventure. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Buffnagel the podcast, where we talk about all things good in the pursuit of the adventure of life. I'm Zach, and we got a fantastic show today where I'm letting Rafe off the rails just a little bit, and I'm going to try my best to rein him in. But with all that said, Rafe, how you doing today?
Zach, I am great. It is winter seems to be coming upon us, as they say. Zach, we had snow showers this night. Did you know that?
Yes, I had them as well.
Oh yeah, you did too. Yeah, you're getting like a blizzard. All right. Anyway, hey, thanks for listening. Thanks for coming, everybody. We are glad you are here. We're thanks to you. We are a global top 10% podcast. You can reach us all the time at buffnagel.com. We're all over the interweb. Type in Buffnagel the podcast, and we show up. We show up like a, I don't know, sure, insert your favorite metaphor here. All right. Hey, if you're new to the podcast, welcome. Thank you for coming. We're glad you are here. Hey, give us 4 episodes and we will give you a reason to come back for more. We're talking about all sorts of things and something will certainly resonate with you. And remember, tell a friend to listen and you get a free episode. And if you subscribe and leave us a 5-star review, I get pudding. You know what? I'll even give you indulgences. All right. And I can give those, Zach. All right, I give indulgences, and I get pudding. So that's a good reason to come and listen. Speaking of indulgences, Zach, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, I'm letting you off the rails a little bit, out of your cage a bit, and we're talking about something you've wanted to talk about for a little bit on this show, and you're like, Zach, you're going to talk about all your mental health stuff and self-development and all these other things. Let me talk about my thing. Let me talk about my thing. And then we get to the thing, it's like, oh, I'm not ready to talk about my thing, but we're finally ready for you to talk about your thing. And today, we're talking about, I believe, one of your favorite people from history, probably one of the most adored and glorified person in French history, and that would be Joan of Arc.
Joan of Arc. All right, now I'm going to start off with the first and the easy Joan of Arc joke because this goes back to my childhood, Zach. Okay, just so you know, everybody knows Joan of Arc was not Noah's wife. Okay, that's
actually a joke.
Yeah, it's a joke, didn't you?
That's a really bad joke.
You have never heard that?
No.
Okay.
I had good jokes in my childhood.
All right, Joan of Arc was not Noah's wife. Joan of Arc is a middle ages a young girl who led the French army to victory and is revered in France and in other places. But here's the story of Joan of Arc. Okay, so we're going to rewind to the 100 Years' War, which ran from about 1337.
Which was more than 100 years.
Yeah, well, there was that calendar.
They rounded down, and then, the sun happened with the thing and the calendar, so you never know. So they just called it 100.
100 years. We're just keeping it even that way, all right? So about 1340 to 1450, that kind of time frame, okay? Just to put this in perspective, because we've talked about like when the great Renaissance Ninja Turtles were doing their art. Okay, that was started late 1300s into 1400s, 1500s. All right, Gutenberg, the Bible guy, was 1400 to 1468. So the movable type came in around 1450. Right about the end of the 100 Years' War was movable type started taking off, and books were being printed in that thing. Columbus was 1492. So we're in the last 100 years before Europe breaks out into the age of exploration. All right, and Charles the Sixth. Okay, Charles the Sixth was king of France. All right, and England was kind of like they were fighting the French in the 100 Years' War, and Henry V was king of France king of England in 1420. Okay, 1420. Henry V defeats the French at Agincourt. All right, and we actually talked about this last week, Zach, when we talked about the Henry V Shakespeare play, and we talked about the phrase "band of brothers." That comes from them discussing the upcoming battle at Agincourt. All right, and what happened is Henry V at that time from England then laid claim to the throne in France. All right,
Yeah.
and we can go around and around on some of this stuff and talk about how the French actually the English were actually French because it was the French that with William the Conqueror in 1066.
Yeah, so in 1066, William the Conqueror crosses the English Channel, which probably at the time was called some body of water, and here be dragons or something. But he crosses over the English Channel, heads into England, hangs out with some Celts, hangs out with some Druids, and hangs out with some Saxons, and eventually establishes what we now refer to as modern day England. And with that, created the modern day English royalty, which was based off of people of French heritage. And then eventually, these people got smart and like, hey, let's, we think we have claim to this throne over here across the channel. So they go to war with France for the claim of a throne that they think they have. Because if you know anything about history and you know anything about the French throne, pretty much everyone thinks that they have a stake to it. So everyone just kind of just goes for it and hopes for the best.
Yeah, so we were in the middle of that. All right, so Henry V comes from England. He lays claim to the French throne. Charles VI was French, right? He lays claim to the throne, and they're fighting this 100 Years' War. Well, in 1422, Henry V and Charles VI died. Okay, so they both died, and Henry VI becomes King of England and France. All right, so he says, "I am King of England and France." But he was only a kid. He was like 10 years old or something like that. So he had a regent named Lancaster who kind of ran the show for him, right? And that was his uncle. Now, Joan of Arc, in the meantime, is a 10-year-old girl living in France. Okay, she was born in 1412, and she's living in an area called Domremy, not do re mi like the song, but Domremy, Domremy.
There's a little fancy thing above the
Well,
E
I
as
think
well.
there's a little like
Fancy thing above the E.
The English I grew up with in Wisconsin didn't have all those little accoutrements on the letters. We didn't have all that fancy spelling. We didn't have all your fancy pronunciations. All right, but I think it's pronounced do re mi. All right, in France, and that's an area in France that is loyal to the French king.
Yeah,
Right?
and that's Northeast French. Very French, very loyal. Hey, go Team France.
Charles is our guy.
Yep.
All right, so this is in 1422. So there's all this stuff going on, and she's this little girl growing up there. Her parents, her father is a peasant landowner, which is probably oxymoronic, Zach, don't you think?
Yes, we can debate this a little bit more if we want to, but might as well, since we're here early as opposed to later in the episode when we get drowned out a bit. But there are rumors and some myths and some just weird things going on with her family history, specifically with the fact that she may or may not have been Charles's half sibling. And this leads to the questions that you mentioned with, a peasant being a landowner, specifically like 50 acres of land, which is a lot of acreage for someone who's considered a peasant or poor, especially in Northeast France, especially during the Middle Ages.
Yeah. So Jacques d'Arc, who was Joan of Arc's father, he owns this land, and he has this daughter, Joan. All right. And then she was a child, Zach. They considered her to be very pious, very, very holy, very, very, very calm, reserved. She was like the perfect child, right? And everybody thought she was like almost mystic as a kid. That she was very devout, and she was the little girl that you all want to have as your daughter, not the rebellious hellions that we see nowadays. Those little whippersnappers. She was a good kid, as they say. All right. And in 1425, at age 13, she sees a vision. Right. And she sees a vision of three saints. She sees Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. Now, Saint Michael he's the warrior guy. All right. Saint Michael is he's
the archangel.
He's the archangel. He's carrying a sword. He kicks butt and takes names. He is the man. He is tough guy, warrior, angel, saint guy. All right, but Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret were in the 4th century. They were virgins, both martyred at a young age. All right, Saint Catherine was a princess. She converted at age 14 and then was martyred at age 18. Zach, they tried to use she was to be martyred with a breaking wheel. Do you know what that is?
No, but it sounds painful.
It is very painful. It's this big wheel, like from a wagon, and you take it and you hit people with it until they die. It's a really, really bad. You want to read some gruesome stuff? Go look. I'm not going to say any more than that. But they tried to smash her with the breaking wheel, and it broke, and she lived. So they're like, well, enough of that, and then they cut off her head. All right. So that was Saint Catherine. All right, and then Saint Margaret was a virgin who refused to marry the governor. Okay, the governor of the area wanted to marry her, but he said, "You got to marry me, but you got to quit this whole Christianity thing. That's a bad idea." And she said, "No, I'm not going to do it." And he was like, "Well, I will torture you and kill you." And she was like, "I don't care." And so they tortured her, and then they martyred her by cutting her head off too. All right, that's pretty much the one that always works is the head removal. That's a hard one to get past. The breaking wheel, sometimes that goes your way, but anyway, she saw these. Okay, both these ladies were martyred at a very young age, and I'm thinking if you're seeing that vision, that should be kind of a warning sign, because that's exactly what happened to little Joan. All right, but not before she did some really awesome stuff. All right, so the vision, the saints came to her and pretty much said, "Hey, tell the English to go home."
Yeah, and besides telling the English to go home, all of France was doing that at the time. But additionally, it was telling her specifically, hey, go support Charles, help in this war, and get these fakers, fake French people, back to fake France in England, and do that, help in some way, and provide relief and provide morale, and do something, and go.
Yeah, go.
It's your world.
Yeah, so that's what she did, all right? And she said these visions were beautiful, they were lovely, and a lot of people have said, well, maybe she had epilepsy, or maybe she had demonic possession, or maybe she had this other mental illness. And you know what? Maybe she had a vision, right? That seems that seems to me the easy one for there. Okay, so she has this vision at 13. So by the time she's 16, she's like, I better go do this thing these guys told me to do. So she tries to get to the French court, and she meets these army guys, and she says, hey, I want to go see them because I had this vision. They told me I'm supposed to command an army. And they were like, yeah, right. Go home, girl. So they send her home, but then she turns around a couple months later and she goes back, and she's talking to the army guys, and they were like, well, really, why should we trust you with going to see the king? And, we're fighting this 100 years war, baby. We need some, if you're going to take over, we need some proof that you got the goods. All right.
Yeah.
So she says,
well, and especially too, like if you're a French soldier and here's this girl from farmland who's maybe illiterate, saying that, hey, the voice of God instructed me to, take charge of the country's army and we're going to win. Like, I like the winning part, but like the other part, like when, especially a girl from, farmland, who's probably not well educated, who are all these other things, like and especially if you're a big tough military guy in France, it's like,
yeah, right.
Okay. Like we need something.
We need something. So she gave him something. Okay. And this is how it always goes with these visions. One day we'll talk about Our Lady of Guadalupe and what happened with Juan Diego and the roses. But Joan produced. She gave up the goods, and the goods were that she said there was going to be there's going to be news of a victory at Orleans. And next thing you know, this guy comes up and says, hey, not sure you heard, we had this great victory at Orleans. And they were like, they turned to her and she said, how'd you know that? And she was like, come on, who am I? I'm Joan of Arc. All right. So they take her to the royal court to meet the king and to tell her story to King Charles. And so on her way there, they have to ride through very dangerous place because, you know what, quite frankly, Zach, there's a war on. All right. So she dresses up like a page boy so she can pass easily through the war area. And this becomes relevant later on. All right. And she meets with Charles VII in 1429 when she is a 17-year-old girl. And she explains to him that she needs to lead the army.
Yeah. So she shows up. She's like, hey, talking to the council people. I'm here now. I know some stuff about some things. I can tell you that later, but I'm here. I'm in charge. And, again, there's still that little bit of hesitation, especially because the city was being besieged at the time. And, well, they were being besieged for a while, and they were not, okay, how are you going to help us, little girl? It doesn't instill a lot of faith, but
Yep.
sometimes you got to act on faith alone.
Right. And so they took the risk. All right. So he said, all right, we've been deathless for like 100 years. We'll give you a shot. So they give Joan a shot. She goes to, but before they send her to Orleans, they do an inquiry into her. So they do interviews. They do a background check. Zach, is what they do. It's like when you're trying to get a job, they do a background check, and and the people who spoke on her behalf said she was just freaking awesome. All right, she was humble, she was honest, she was full of simplicity, and they were like, she is everything. She is the real deal. This is the one you need to trust her. So they sent her to Orleans, where the English had been holding the city siege for 6 months. And Joan shows up and she says, like, what are you guys just doing sitting here in the behind the walls? And they were like, we're under siege, we can't do anything. She was like, let's go.
I'm on a mission from God.
That's right. She says that. So she leads this attack out to an English Bastille, where a place where they're holed up.
Yep.
And she kicks their butt out there. And then there's one of this first miracle of her in battle is they had this convoy of stuff going up and down the river. I forget exactly how it goes, but when they attacked, going with the wind downhill or down with the wind behind them, and then when they needed to retreat and go back after they had kicked the English out, the winds shifted and pushed their ships right back home, and everybody was like, Joan's the greatest thing ever here, and we want her to be our leader lady.
Yeah, and so she was there, and while she was there, in a very, very short amount of time, I can get to that in just a second, they saw tremendous success with these reverse sieges, with this, just taking the attack to the British. And then 9 days later, yes, 9, you can look on your hands how small of a number that is, the siege was over, and the British just kind of said, bye, we're not coming back here, we can't.
We are done sieging.
Yeah, we can't do this. And historically, from a military point of view, that was probably should not have happened, especially given land advantages and other military things that I don't really know enough about. But some people who do know enough about are just like, yeah, this shouldn't have happened. Something greater than was at play.
Yeah, and so Joan gets credited with miraculous military victories over the English at Orleans, and by May 8th, like Zach said, 9 days later, the French have driven out the English. The siege was over, and of course, the English see this stuff, and they were like, you know what, that girl's a witch.
Yeah,
she's possessed by some spirit. This is bad. She's bad all around. We need to take that girl out.
Yeah. So, and this is in 1429, and then additionally, because of her presence in Orleans, the military kind of got boosted morale. They were like, okay, cool. Like we got a little something on our end. So it boosted the morale for the French and allowed them to continue on and kind of push through a final French victory in the 100 Years' War in 1453. So this was not the end of the war, but it was the tipping point for the French.
Yeah, and so that was in May of 1429, Zach. But by July, Charles VII was named king. All right, so he claimed the throne at that point in July. They had pushed the English back enough. The English and the Burgundians were holed up at Compiegne, all right, which is, I don't know, it's in France. All right, they're up farther north and west. All right, and then in May of 1430, the next spring, Joan was there as part of a rear guard that was during a retreat after an attack, and she was captured by the British and the I have trouble with this word, Zach. Burgundians, right?
Burgundian. So
Burgundy.
It is a very French word, which is important to note because this was French nobles who sided with the English during the 100 Years' War.
Yeah, so they were on the same.
They were technically, you could look at it as traitors, or Benedict Arnolds if you want to go with that term.
Yeah. So but they were there. They were French, and you're right, Zach. They were siding with the English. So I mean, there's all sorts of stuff going on. But
Yeah,
the English and the Burgundians captured Joan, and they took her to a place called Rouen, right? And then they put her in prison, and then on trial. Okay, and they put her on trial. They're trying to figure out what you can't just say we think she's a witch, burn her. Well, you can. You can't say that in a Monty
they did
Python
that in
show.
Monty Python,
Yeah, you can do that,
so
but
it
then
must be true.
it ends up in the way they did that, right? They put her on trial for heresy, Zach, right? And being a heretic is not a good thing, but you can be back then you can be charged for heresy by for cross dressing, right? So if she was a girl dressed as a boy, they were like, you know what, that ain't right, so you shouldn't do that. And if you do it twice, you're out. Head gone, breaking wheel, whatever you want. We're gonna take care of it. So on the 9th of January, 1431. So maybe a little over half a year later, after she was captured, she was finally put on trial, essentially for cross dressing, and it was a sham trial. It was poorly run. The records falsified. Of course, the English were running it, okay, and they were charging her with heresy. It probably would have been better to just charge her with siding with France, and it would have been at least appeared on the surface to be more just.
Yeah, and additionally, you mentioned this, but I think it's important to note. So she was captured, and then she was transported. When she was transported to the French word that I can't pronounce, that is a French city in modern day France. She did not cross the English
Right,
Channel into England. So
right.
it was, you
Rouen.
know, it was like a satellite state, a satellite city of English nobility or people who were loyal to the English in the country that we consider France today. It's near Normandy, if you want to look it up on the map. But it was north, close to the English Channel. So it had that English sphere of influence, which is where the trial took place. So she did get tried technically on home soil.
Yeah, but the what do they say? The refs were from the other conference, right?
Yeah,
Something like that. So there were all sorts of things about that. I mean, so she was kept in the prison, right? And when she was in the prison, because the guards were bastards, all right, they kept trying to rape her. So she would wear like leggings and pants and stuff underneath her dress to keep her from getting raped. All right. And this was one of the things they said, well, see, that's cross dressing against the rules. Going to burn you at the stake. And she was like, dude, I got to do this to protect my modesty. All right. So, and that was at a time when, Aquinas taught, Zach, that cross-dressing was a thing. It wasn't always wrong. It was wrong in context. All right. So if you were doing what she was doing, which was, you're in a state of war, and you have to protect your modesty when you're going through the land of evil people, then that was okay. So he would have argued that things were all right from her point of view. But of course, the British didn't see it that way. They were siding with the army to try to get rid of her because they thought she was bad for the English. So she is said to have defended herself very, very well in this trial. And one of the things that was interesting, there's a quote or an exchange that's in the record that is considered to be the most famous exchange. So she's this peasant girl, Zach, who is illiterate peasant in quotes, illiterate in quotes.
illiterate.
So, yeah. All right. But she is, she's apparently filled with grace. So they said when she was asked if she knew that she was in God's grace, she answered, quote, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God so keep me. I should be the saddest creature in the world if I knew I were not in his grace." All right. And that seems like, okay, that's kind of dancing around the subject a little bit. But that question was a trap, right? The Pharisees used to do this to Jesus all the time. They'd ask him a question and try to trap him in that, okay? And so these guys tried to trap Joan there, because if she would have answered yes, that she was in God's grace, that would have been heresy in itself, because the church taught that it's not possible to be certain that you are in God's grace. And if she would have said no, that she wasn't in God's grace, then she would have confessed to not being in God's grace and to be guilty of heresy. So what she did by saying, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me," she dances around that, and um, she avoids the inquisitors there. And so this is the illiterate peasant girl that the English inquisitors are up against.
Yeah, and it's important to note too throughout this trial, yes, was to prove that she's, these other things, but it's also to discredit her, to lower the morale of the French army, and to make it like, hey, look, you guys just crowned this guy king of France. Well, he's a fraud because he was supported by this person who's a fraud. It's this whole political faction thing going on that we don't think about in the Middle Ages. We're like, oh yeah, they just burned people because they thought people were witches and they weren't smart. No, this was a strategic move by the English to not handicap but kneecap the French, and then take their spot in the Olympics.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was about the Olympic Games. The that's a wonderful summary of that, Zach. And that's a point that gets lost so many times. We tend to look back in time as if, and we've said this before, as if those people are stupid, right? They didn't have electricity, Zach. They didn't have the internet, Zach. They didn't have cars, Zach. Right? So, and that's supposed to make them somehow less. All right. We stand on the shoulders of giants is where we are. And those people back then, I'm not going to argue that the English were right for doing this. What I'm going to argue is that they were sophisticated in their thinking. All right. They lived in a sophisticated world, a political world, a world of intrigue, of moral philosophy, of all of these different, things that we've kind of abandoned today, in favor of cat videos on our phones. They lived in a very sophisticated world, even though they didn't have the internet.
Yeah, and you mentioned this, so I'm going to have to bring it up. The bishop who presided over this trial, Pierre Conchon, Cauchon. He was trained. He was educated at the University of Paris. He excelled in the liberal arts. He studied canon law and theology. He became a priest. He had this academic background that might make your academic background look like nothing. Like, he had this status and symbol. He wasn't just this guy who, hey, you're a witch. He understanding of philosophy, understanding of ethics and logic and like those type of things that we forget about sometimes in this day and age. He used that strategically to put Joan of Arc in a difficult position to say that, hey, the guy you made king is a fraud because of you.
Right, and that's a really an amazing thing. It's this poor little girl who rose to prominence in at the battle there at the siege of Orleans. They drag her in there and put her in the middle of this war of a political thing. She was just like, I'm just doing what the angels told me to do. I'm just doing what they were told. And there's a lot of stuff going on around the outside. This was not a society that was simply, peasants living in the dirt and, strong people telling them what to do. This was at least it was sophisticated. And you said, they had knowledge of ethics. That didn't mean they always followed them, though, does it?
Yes.
Right. And that's, they had, Zach, they had the same foibles we did. They suffer for the same problems that we do. And, all right, just because they didn't have cat videos doesn't make them stupid. So she goes on trial. She's being charged with heresy. They pull all these people out to testify against her, and they finally find her guilty on the 29th of May in 1431. And of course, she immediately appeals, and she goes on death row for 26 years. No, that's not what happened. The next day, she is taken from the prison, and she is burned at the stake in Rouen. They built scaffolds, Zach. There were 10,000 people in attendance watching this spectacle, all right, from bleachers. All right, they tie her to the stake, they pack the wood around it, and they light up the wood. And it's it's astounding. She has said that she said, make a cross and hold it high so I may see it above the flames. And they burned her to death at the stake, Zach, and then the English pulled her body out of the ashes, burned it again, again, and then threw what was remaining into the Seine, which is the river that runs through Paris, and then it runs through Rouen, and then goes out to the English Channel. So the executioner, after he finished all this and saw what had happened, was like all the great executioners in history. He now feared for eternal damnation because he was afraid that he had executed a holy woman.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about, they did this as a political maneuver, and look what it did. The French people, it didn't change the French army at all, because they still went on to win the war. They still went on to have their king. This girl did what she was called to do, and she was successful at it, despite the fact that, it ended up, not very good for her. But with that said, about 200 years later, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 100 years later, I don't know. Numbers are weird when it gets to the Middle Ages for me. But she was given a retrial after her death, in which they found that she was declared innocent.
Yeah,
so there is a silver lining.
Yeah, it was 1456. The church retried her and found her innocent. Of course, they did. It is interesting. You can read. There is so much documentation of this trial. It is. There are scholars that say there is probably nobody in the Middle Ages whose life is better documented than Joan of Arc. Right, the records still exist. You know who did what, who said what, who signed what, and it's a very well documented trial, and that's why it probably has so much staying power.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned this, so I'll bring it up as well. But Mary, Queen of Scots, even her life wasn't as documented as the trial of Joan of Arc. And she was a royal figure for the British. In that magnitude, in this time period, this was if it was today, it would be the only thing you would follow on the news. It was that big, that momentous, and that powerful of a thing that happened. And all of the information is documented. You know who said what. You know where each person was. And you can see and you can understand the manipulation that was trying to be made in this trial. It was all to disprove this girl so that they could take over the throne. And it didn't work, which is the most beautiful thing about it.
Well, and that's, you mentioned that. You say, here's a person who got tied up in a political scandal, who got tried in a political scandal and put to death. All right. And it didn't work out for the people who did that. All right. And that sounds like another trial that took place 1400 years prior to that in Jerusalem. All right. The 100 Years' War ended 22 years later after Joan of Arc's execution, and the French won that. The English lost their alliance with the Burgundians, right, in 1435. Henry VI, who was this child king in England, he sucked as king because he was just a kid, right? Kid can't be king, Zach. A kid can't be king. You know why? Because they don't know anything. Because they're kids, right? That's why you whippersnappers. Nothing. Whippersnappers can't be kings. All right, and then of course the church retried her in 1456. Now her legend, the mythos,
her legacy.
Thank you. Her legacy, it grew. Okay, and by the early 1900s, she was beatified in 1909 and then canonized in 1920. And Joan of Arc is considered one of the great saints of France. And Napoleon thought she was awesome, didn't he?
Yeah. So Napoleon, before he decided to, be a terrible general at the Battle of Waterloo, but that's a different point entirely. He made the decision to declare her a national symbol of France in 1803, and then that was before her canonization by the Catholic Church. So even Napoleon recognized her greatness.
Yeah, and so she is written about. There's, if you go look at she's in art all over the place. Zach, she was in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure along with Socrates. All right, so she's got
Napoleon,
that's right. So
and Beethoven.
Oh, I forgot about him.
Beethoven plays John Bon Jovi's living on a prayer.
Does he really say what he's doing? Yeah. So that is a movie you ought to see just because well, it's just awesome. It's just a fun thing. But Joan of Arc is in there, and Joan of Arc is a wonderful piece of history. It is an unfortunate event, but it's one that we need to know if we want to understand the history of Christendom, the history of France and England, and how things got to be as they are now.
Yeah, you mentioned this. With her artwork, there are multiple sculptures of her riding on a horse into battle. She's not carrying a sword usually. Usually, she's just carrying a flag. A sword and other military weapons are usually not on her person, which is a reference to she was kind of the a religious fighter, not a military fighter. And additionally, there is a beautiful gilded bronze statue in Paris of her, which if you go to Paris, if the world ever lets us travel again, that is something maybe you check out before or after you go to the Louvre. But that's just my opinion on how you should appreciate your history.
Yeah, so there is she is somebody to be known. She is a story to be studied, and she saw something that she thought she should do. She wrestled with it for a while, and then she did it. And you can argue, well, it didn't end very well for her. Like, you know what? In 600 years, 700 years, if we're talking about you, hey, then you have something to say. But Joan of Arc lives on in her legendary status. Her legacy lives
Her legacy
on.
continues as well. It's not just hey, there is this art that was made in 1700 or whenever it was made. There are current military vessels of the French army that are named in references to her. There are so many of these things in French culture, in French vernacular, in French appreciation that goes to this girl from a small village who said, hey, the British suck. Let's get them out of here, which is a very French, thing for everyone to get behind. If you've met French people, and they talk about their sports rivalries or their generic rivalries with British in general, there is a dislike there, and having someone be able to unite the country, bring people together, and to do that and celebrate it in this way is a very, very special honor.
Yeah, so that's the short story of Joan of Arc. There are, like I said, the trial is excruciatingly documented. So there has been much written about her. I mean, we spent 35 minutes talking about her here. I'll bet you could, Zach. We could spend 3 or 4 episodes just on the siege of Orleans, and that would be, and we probably wouldn't cover what we need to cover. So it's a great story, a great lady of history, a great lady of France, and a great lady of Christendom. Unfortunately, things didn't go well for her at Rouen, but you gotta figure out what you're going to stand for and what you're going to do. And if you need an example, look to Joe.
Yeah. Hold your ground and do what you think is best. Do your job. Try to do the right thing and positively impact people's lives. And that's what we can learn from Joan of Arc. I want to thank you all for listening. I want to remind you to go seek the good, be the good, and spread the good. Enjoy the adventure of life.